What do a Thomas Pynchon novel about the Second World War, a book by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and the Vanna Venturi house all have in common? Not much, you might reasonably think. But one thing that they do have in common is that they are all seen as prime examples of postmodernism. From this, we can immediately conclude that it will be hard to define postmodernism. But we can also see some themes that are common to many people's ideas about postmodernism. In architecture, for instance, postmodernism is associated with combining different styles in one building in such a way that they collide with each other. In literature, it is associated with books that rely on fragmentation, paradox, and unreliable narration. In philosophy, it is associated with the idea that there are no objective descriptions of reality and that there are instead many different perspectives on the world that are all, in a sense, true. In each of these instances, postmodernism emphasizes disunity, variety, the existence of things that do not fit together. It opposes the idea that the world is a well-ordered, simple system. In this course, we will focus on postmodernism in philosophy, which became important from the 60s onwards and is still influential in the way we think, especially in the humanities. And for the purposes of our course, I want to characterize postmodernism in terms of two attacks. An attack first on what I will call foundations, and an attack second on the idea that truth is one, that there is one single true way to describe the world. Now, instead of immediately going to the postmodern philosophers themselves, I want to start by talking at length about their most famous and most important predecessor, a philosopher of the late 19th century who already held many of the postmodernist theses and who has influenced probably every postmodern philosopher of the 20th and the 21st century. That philosopher is the German thinker Friedrich Nietzsche. And what I am going to do is I'm going to trace both of the attacks that the postmodernists perform, the attack on foundations and the attack on the unity of truth, back to Nietzsche's thought. In this lecture, we are going to look at the attack on foundations. So, what exactly is a foundation? Here is an example. I make some moral statement, like it's bad to kill people. You then ask me how I know that. And my answer is, well, just consult your conscience. Your conscience will tell you that it's wrong to kill people. So far, so good. But you are a philosopher, so you go one step further and you ask me, well, but how do you know that your conscience is right? And I say, if you really consult your conscience, you will know that it is always right. All healthy people will find the same truths in their conscience and they will just know that their conscience is right. Now, in that example, I am putting forward conscience as a foundation for morality. It is a foundation because of two things. First, it justifies my moral claims. If you wonder whether it is really bad to kill people, I offer your conscience as a proof. And second, your conscience itself doesn't need any justification. According to my theory, when you consult your conscience, you will just know that it's right. So, a foundation is something that justifies some of your claims, but that doesn't need justification itself. In the same way that the foundation of a house supports the rest of the house, but doesn't itself need to be supported by a further foundation. Now, conscience is just an example, of course. An influential foundation for morality has been God, where people claim that if you seriously search for God, not only will you find him, but this will also deliver moral certainty to you. An influential foundation for knowledge about the world is the scientific method, where we say that you should believe something because science tells you it is so, and we add that anyone who can think clearly will be able to see that the scientific method simply is the best way of investigating the world. And so on. Many different things can be offered as foundations for many other things. But what these attempts all share is that they try to base certain claims on something else that is absolutely certain, unshakable, and the same for everyone. It is something that everybody, or at least everybody who is in their right minds, should be able to agree on. Now, Nietzsche believes that every attempt to give a foundation is bound to fail, and that everyone who believes that he has found a foundation is just deceiving themselves. A foundation may seem self-evident, Nietzsche points out. It may be inconceivable to us that anyone could think differently. Perhaps I just can't imagine that anyone would be unable to find in their conscience the rule that it's wrong to kill people. But what does that prove? Nietzsche wonders. Surely it proves no more than that my imagination is rather limited. My feeling of certainty in no way proves that I'm right. Nietzsche attacks the foundations that people have come up with in all kinds of ways. But one is especially important: his genealogies. A Nietzschean genealogy is an investigation into the origins of our values. An investigation that, in the hands of Nietzsche, invariably shows that those values are the results of events that are not really worthy of our respect. Take conscience. Somebody who believes that our conscience is our moral guide might believe that it is a special sense for morality, or that it is a divine spark, or a gift of God. But is that the real origin of conscience? Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, gave us a Nietzschean genealogy of conscience when he told us that conscience really is the internalization of the demands made upon us by our parents and our society. Our conscience is just an internal voice that repeats what society has told us. That we are not allowed to kill, that we should work hard, and so on. But if that's true, if our conscience is not divine or in touch with the real good, but just the voice of society that we have internalized, then why should we listen to it? I use the example of Freud because Nietzsche's own genealogy of conscience is quite complicated. But in essence, he claims that it is based on our wish to hurt and dominate other people. When society stops us from doing so, those wishes are turned inwards, and instead of other people, we hurt and dominate ourselves through feelings of guilt and through the demands of our conscience. Whether you take Freud's story or Nietzsche's story, the effect is basically the same. If that is where conscience is coming from, then it just doesn't seem to be something that we have to accept uncritically. Now, probably the most famous of Nietzsche's genealogies is that of the Christian values of humility, compassion, peacefulness, and so on. According to Nietzsche, these can be traced back to two groups of people in the Roman Empire. Those who were powerful and happy, and who extolled the virtues of courage, creativity, self-assertion, and so on. And the weak and powerless, the poor and the oppressed, who had to be humble and peaceful, because otherwise they would be beaten down. It is this second group, Nietzsche tells us, who came up with the idea that being humble and being peaceful, which they had to be anyway because they were weak, was also the morally right way to be. And, Nietzsche tells us, Through more or less random historical events, this way of looking at things became dominant in Europe. With these examples in our mind, let us return to the question of foundations. Throughout history, people have claimed to find things which are so obvious, so self-evident, that every normal human being should be able to see it as well and agree with them. But Nietzsche's core claim here is that obviousness and self-evidence in no way prove that something is true. All they really prove, he would say, is that these things are old. To quote one of Nietzsche's many beautiful aphorisms in Fool, he writes this: "Whatever lives long is gradually so saturated with reason that its irrational origins become improbable. Does not almost every accurate history of the origin of something sound paradoxical and sacrilegious to our feelings? Doesn't the good historian constantly contradict?" Anything, Nietzsche is saying here, that has been part of our culture for a long time will seem logical and obvious to us. After just a century or so, it seems so logical to us that democracy is the best form of government that we can hardly believe that there are any people in the world who can't see this obvious truth. Something like conscience, which has been with us for maybe 2000 years or longer, must appear even more obvious and unassailable. But, Nietzsche suggests, as soon as we do genealogy, as soon as we unearth the hidden origins of these values, then things look very different. Conscience might come from mere submission. Democracy, according to Nietzsche, comes from resentment and a herd mentality. This origin, of course, in no way proves that what conscience tells us is wrong, or that democracy is a bad form of government. Bad origins can produce good things, just as good wombs can bear bad sons. But what it does show, according to Nietzsche, is that these things are not foundations, because it is possible to look at them critically and to have very different opinions about them. Real foundations, foundations which are so obvious that everyone agrees about them and that put a stop to all argumentation, such foundations, according to Nietzsche, simply do not exist. And that is a conclusion that the postmodernists wholeheartedly agree with.